Um, Leah and Eric will be taking questions at the end of the session. So as you have questions, feel free to throw them into the chat and I will read them out after they are done presenting. So now I will turn it over to Leah and Eric to introduce themselves.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mandy. And I guess just a quick sound check, thumbs up from either Eric or Mandy that folks can hear me and I'm not still muted. Cool. Awesome. And aside from that, just a general accessibility statement, feel free to drop a comment in the chat or use the raise hand feature or anything if there are any sound or other technical issues, or if we need to slow down or repeat ourselves, and Mandy will get our attention. So to introduce myself, my name is Leah Bowers. I use she, they pronouns. A visual description of myself is that I am sitting in my home office surrounded by colorful art and decorations. I have brown and highlighter green hair, black glasses, and I am a user experience architect from the Center for User Experience.
And I'm Eric Geiger. I'm a web operations manager with Do It Communications. I'm a white male with black glasses and no hair.
I'll start by establishing what we mean when we say, or how we define disability and accessible content. We can think about a disability as a mismatch between a person's capabilities and what their society, situation, or culture demands. We dropped an icebreaker in the chat that talks about this a little bit, but the image in the slide is from a Microsoft guide on inclusive design, and it shows examples of permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities related to touch, sight, hearing, and speaking. It's fair to say that it isn't a question of if someone has a disability, but it's a question of when someone might experience a disability. There are all kinds of reasons that people need accessible content, and many accessibility accommodations can support people with any range of abilities. For example, video captions. These are crucial points of access for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. They can also support somebody who's experiencing hearing loss due to an ear infection or an injury, or somebody who's just working in a loud or public space and doesn't necessarily want to have the audio from their video blaring. By making our content accessible, a person with a disability has access to the same information, the ability to engage in the same interactions, and can enjoy the same services and benefits as a person without a disability.
Preparing for disability. Making your presentations accessible helps you reach a wider audience. Throughout the presentation process, from preparation to delivery and follow-up, there are several accessibility factors to consider. Let's begin by exploring some things to consider before your presentation, best practices that involve creating materials and preparing for the event. Slide titles. Try to structure and design your presentation materials in a way that accommodates the audience's experience. Slide titles are important to the overall structure of your presentation. Think of slide titles as serving the same purpose as headings in a web page. They label, organize, and provide context to the information you're sharing. They help assistive technology users navigate your content. A person using a screen reader will often be able to navigate through a slide deck via the title, so it's important that the title of each slide is unique and pertinent to the information. Font size and weight. Styling of text and other visual elements also affects the accessibility of your slides. Font size and weight affect the legibility of text. Larger, bold fonts are typically more legible. We recommend using at least a 24-point font. If you're used to working in documents, that probably sounds huge, but on this slide, the larger font is actually 30 points, while the smallest is 12 points, which is more like what you would expect in a document. Text spacing and legibility. Having adequate space around text is also important for legibility. When line height is too small, the text can appear cramped and be difficult to read. On the other hand, if the line height is too large, the user may have a difficult time following the flow of text. The ideal line height is generally 1.5 to 2 times the font height, but it depends on the font style, and size. In this slide from right to left, the line heights are 0.75, 1.5, and 2.5 times the font height, which is 18. Avoid cluttered slides. Slides with too many words, animations, images, or diagrams can make it difficult for the audience to pay attention to you or focus on the important information from your presentation. Cluttered slides distract the users from your discussion of key points. Elements that may clutter your slide include lengthy paragraphs of text, too many images, or complex or cluttered images. This slide illustrates a negative example that I've seen in many presentations, the wall of logos. It consists of a collage of corporate logos under the heading, the clients. Lists are more accessible. An alternative to the wall of logos shown on the previous slide, consider how much cleaner and readable a simple list is.
Using color in a way that's accessible can help folks see the content on your slides from anywhere in the audience. To use color in an accessible way, avoid relying solely on color to convey information. Using color alone can pose a barrier to people with color blindness or low vision. So if you want to highlight information, consider using text, symbols, shapes, or other visual indicators in addition to or as an alternative to color. And also be sure to check the contrast between the colors that you're using in your slides or your handouts, whether that's graphical elements or text and background color combinations. And another thing of note is that photographs or other patterned images don't make for very good backgrounds for text. They add to the visual clutter like Eric was talking about on slides, and the variation in the colors in the background makes it difficult to ensure high enough contrast between the text and all of the background colors. On this slide, we have an image of results from a tool, a color contrast checker tool called the Wave Contrast Checker. And we've linked to that later in our slides, and those should be available on the event site. Sometimes it's tough to tell when colors are going to be legible to all folks who will be accessing content visually. So this tool helps to test contrast against web content standards that are developed to support people with various vision or color blindness. When in doubt, black and white have the highest possible color contrast, so those are a really reliable text and background combination. Alternative text, or alt text, is a concise text substitute for non-text content like images. If you're sharing your slides or handouts digitally with your audience, screen reader users and screen readers will announce alt text in place of images in your documents. Alt text should be short, about a sentence or two, and descriptive of the image and how it relates to the content. If you're using an image when you're presenting, it's usually to give more information or evoke a certain feeling from your audience. And it's important for alt text to convey that same context. So for example, I could give the image on this slide to you with as little context as possible. People using laptops at desks. But if the presentation were about modern students or classroom technology, I might say something like students seated in a crowded lecture hall using laptops during class. It gives just a little more information and evokes a feeling of a cramped and outdated space that wasn't designed to be used the way that students use classrooms today. Sometimes the information that images are meant to convey is more complex than just a sentence or two. We might want to show a chart or infographic like the sprawling flow chart on this slide to deliver a lot of information at a glance, or assuming that people are going to go back and access your presentation materials later to view it more closely. But tables, flowcharts, and graphs are all excellent visual aids, but they're really difficult to make accessible. If an image's relevance to your presentation can't be described just briefly to the audience, consider breaking it down into the elements of the image to highlight main points, summarizing categories, or describing the data trend that you're trying to show with a particular graph, things like that. You might have to break up information across multiple slides, but highlighting the important information is helpful to all of the members of your audience. And a bulleted list, like the one pictured in this slide, are a lot more accessible to screen readers than complex images. So most of all, just try to avoid using over complex information or information dense images in your presentations. Keep the information being shared in the actual presentation concise, and maybe share more detailed information or images or other visuals in a more accessible format that your audience can follow up with later, like a website or a digital document that has more space for descriptive and supportive text. But still, images aren't the only media that folks share in presentations. You might want to use a video or an animation or some sort of other multimedia. And so captions and transcripts are going to be vital access points for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, as we mentioned earlier, but they might also be supportive to all of your users. So if you're linking to any videos that your audience might try to access later or even share, it's important to make sure that those videos or audio clips have captions and transcripts that are accurate. A lot of videos that you might just find on the internet that you want to share have auto-generated captions, so be sure to watch through with captions on to make sure that they're accurate and synced to the audio. It's also important to make sure that any animations or videos that you're sharing only play through once or briefly. Aside from being distracting when you're trying to give a presentation, repetitive images can cause, or I'm sorry, moving images can cause motion sickness, or repetitive and flashing images can also be seizure triggers for folks that are viewing your content. But also videos introduce other tech problems during presentations that can be a barrier to any audience member. AV systems are a mystery to us all, and sometimes the sound doesn't work in a way that you'd expect, or internet connection can interfere with streaming a video, or lag if it's a hybrid or remote presentation like this one. So consider summarizing the key points that you wanted to take out of the video and maybe linking the video to share with audience members later, instead of actually during your presentation.
Preparing. Evaluate your slides. We recommend reviewing your content with accessibility best practices in mind. Using an accessibility checking tool like the one built into PowerPoint is a great way to do that. The three images on this slide depict PowerPoint's review menu, the check accessibility button, and the results of an accessibility check, including errors for missing image descriptions, warnings to check the reading order of slides, and a tip pointing out that 2 slides have duplicate titles. Fix any errors the checker finds and consider fixing the warnings and tips too. A search on PowerPoint Accessibility Checker will find the Microsoft article entitled "Make Your PowerPoint Presentations Accessible to People with Disabilities." I'll put the link into chat. Note that Google Slides has no built-in accessibility checker, so you may want to take that into account when choosing between Google Slides and PowerPoint. Anticipate audience needs. Sharing presentation materials in advance provides those who may benefit from it additional time to access the content. When presenting at a conference like this one, coordination of live captions and translation services is probably being provided by the event planner. If such services are available, reminding attendees of them may be helpful. If presenting independently, let your audience know if you are providing these services and who to contact for accommodations.
So on the day of your event, paying attention to the way that you use the physical or digital space, the way that you introduce yourself, and the way you deliver your presentation are all key elements to delivering inclusive and accessible content. When you arrive in this physical space, if you are presenting in person, consider distributing any materials that you're sharing throughout the space, maybe at audience members' seats or the tables that they'll be sitting at, or placing them near the entrance so that it's easier for audience members to discover the materials and access them. If you're presenting remotely or have digital materials, you can share links in the chat. Or if you have sort of a hybrid situation, consider using QR codes on physical materials instead of providing links and things like that, or URLs rather, that people would have to type out. Also be aware of the sight lines in the room if you are doing an in-person presentation. Is the presenter elevated or are they on the same level as the audience? It might be tough to tell in this image on this slide, but even from the very back of the audience where the photographer is positioned, you can see that there's a podium and Chancellor Mnuchin is actually delivering a speech. And since she's slightly elevated on stage in a room, she's visible to folks seated in the back of the room. Speakers that are elevated are easier to see and also easier to hear. But if that isn't possible in the space that you're presenting in, just try to position yourself where you have the highest visibility and can engage with the audience.
Introductions. Prior to introducing yourself, do a sound check like Leah did. Ask if folks in the back of the room or in the live stream can hear you. Provide an accessibility statement. Such a statement may include how to request accommodations, if live captions or translation services are available, how someone might get your attention if they need you to speak more loudly or slowly. Mention whether there are supplementary materials and where folks can find them. When introducing your presentation, encourage people to use the spaces they need by standing, stretching, leaving, or by turning off cameras for remote or hybrid events. Let the audience know your preferred pronouns and describe yourself.
And then a lot of the common best practices for delivering speeches or presentations also increase the accessibility of your delivery. So be prepared to speak at a slower pace, more loudly, clearly than might feel natural, and speak toward the audience, not toward an image behind you. Or if you are in a remote or hybrid presentation, make sure that you're speaking toward the computer where your microphone and camera are, instead of being fixated on a secondary monitor. Also provide spoken descriptions of the images in your slides. For example, on this slide, we have a close-up image of Chancellor Mnuchin delivering a speech in a cap and gown at the recent commencement festivities. And you might notice she's speaking directly into not one, but two microphones, since she has a microphone on the podium and a headset. If you're making any gestures or using any props that are integral to your presentation, be sure to describe what you're doing as well. So I make a lot of hand gestures, probably just as a nervous habit. Describing that I'm waving my hands in front of me might not add a lot to a presentation right now, but if you were doing something like a cooking demonstration, explaining the tools that you're using, explaining that you're finely dicing something or roughly chopping something, describing information like that calls attention to important details for your audience, but it also supports audience members without access to the visual elements of your presentation. And lastly, if your audience doesn't have access to a microphone, repeat any audience questions and comments into the mic so that anyone listening, it's clear to anyone listening what was asked, but also it is then added to the audio for captions and transcripts. Additionally, speak any questions that come in as comments in a chat for the same reason, adds it to that audio file for captioning later. But also those chat files aren't always saved and shared with audience members after the fact.
After your presentation, increase the impact and accessibility of your presentation. Some of the recommendations we make in this section will depend on your role. If you're simply presenting at a conference, others may be responsible for procuring captions and audio description, whereas if you're presenting independently, they'll probably be up to you. When sharing materials, you want to share them in the most accessible manner you are able. A web page is generally more accessible than a PDF, which is more accessible than a PowerPoint slide deck. One caveat though, a PDF of your PowerPoint deck will inherit any accessibility problems in the deck, such as missing alt text or missing or duplicate slide titles. Correcting them prior to conversion is easier than fixing them in the PDF. Captions, or closed captions, as they're often referred to, the availability of which are often indicated by the CC logo shown on this slide, provide a text version of audio content identifying the speaker, their words, relevant ambient sounds such as music, laughter, or applause. Share your videos on sites which support captions, such as Kaltura Media Space. Sites like WordPress may not actually support captions except in specific circumstances that are beyond the scope of this presentation. Captions generated automatically by software, often referred to as machine captions or auto captions, can be useful, but they aren't sufficiently accurate for accessibility. Options for procuring captions include manually correcting audio captions or ordering caption services from a vendor. We recommend vendor captions if you have a budget for them. UW-Madison has negotiated discount rates with a vendor called 3Play for professional captions. Correcting machine captions is time consuming, taking 2 to 4 times the duration of the video to do, and it requires knowledge of conventions and techniques beyond the scope of this presentation. Audio description, or AD, as appearing in the logo on this slide, describes images in your slides and the prompts and gestures you use during the presentation. Adding them after the fact is expensive, time consuming, and after the fact descriptions are often less organic than if you describe these elements during your presentation. For this reason, we recommend consistently describing these elements while you present. If you do so, you may not need additional audio description. As with any such judgment call, we recommend erring on the side of accessibility. So if you're in doubt, consult the Center for UX. Audio descriptions can be distracting to those who need them. I recommend adding them to a separate audio track of your recording, or if that's not possible, post a second copy of your recording with the audio descriptions. Adding audio descriptions yourself requires editing the audio of your recording and knowledge of audio description conventions and techniques, which again are beyond the scope of this presentation. The same vendor, 3Play, also offers professional audio description services.
And finally, make sure that your audience can engage with you after your presentation. Share links to resources that you've referenced throughout your presentation. You might even aggregate them in one spot so folks don't have to sift through your materials. Provide contacts, either personal or to the presentation team, where folks can reach out for more information or to get assistance with barriers that they might be encountering when trying to access your materials. And you might also consider a feedback form or something more anonymous to solicit feedback from your audience, because that's how we grow. As I mentioned, we've aggregated our resources on this slide. We've also misspelled the word guide, I just noticed, in our first guide, the GOOD, if you will. But this includes a link to our Make It Accessible guides, particularly our online and in-person presentation guide, a couple of the evaluation tools that we've mentioned, including the PowerPoint accessibility tool and the Wave accessibility checker, a couple of articles about either DIY media captioning or the vendors that we have contracted on campus, and also a link to the Center for UX webpage where you can learn more about digital accessibility at the university. We've also included contacts. You can directly reach out to Eric or myself if you have any questions or feedback on the presentation or information we shared today. Or again, you can reach out with more general digital accessibility questions to the Center for User Experience through our Let's Connect form. But most of all, thank you for joining us today. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. If anyone wanted to post questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions live.
I promised to add a link to that Microsoft guide. I have done so.
One challenge I've encountered personally is that when contrast is increased to help people with low color sensitivity, it can also create problems for people with sensory issues such as autism, because too much contrast can result in a sensory overload. Has any of the materials you've seen preparing for this spoken of autism or sensory issues specifically?
Sure, that's a really good question, Julie. I haven't seen anything necessarily about particular color combinations that can be overloading. I have seen things that recommend sticking to one color theme throughout all of your slides so that you're not changing as you're going through slides. The background isn't flashing. Folks can sort of get used to the color of the text on the background and maintain that throughout. But that's a really good note that high contrast, or I'm sure like particular color combinations beyond just having contrast considerations might have other considerations on attention. That's something I should look into more.
That's something I just wanted to bring up. It's the best point one can make about that is what Lee already said. Theme, having the same sort of color theme from one slide to another so one does not jar someone with a sensory sensitivity.
So Julie, Leah did mention that black and white is the highest color contrast color scheme you can use in a presentation. Do you have any problems?
That is actually, for me personally, and I'm publicly admitting that I'm on the autism spectrum, which I've done before. But black and white, particularly when there's large areas of color, such as in an illustration or graphic, can be literally painful to look at. Fortunately, as an IT person, I've been able to counter that with desktop settings on my personal workstation that makes the problem a non-issue. But not everyone has the tech savvy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't bother me, but it can bother some people if they're not.
Yeah, absolutely. This is really great information, Julie. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for sharing that personal information.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to go in order that they came in. The first one is from Mindy. It says, do you have tips for reacting as a speaker when an audience is reacting to a captioning mistake?
Sure. So I guess I'm not sure if this is referring to live captions or if someone's following up after the fact about the captions that you've provided after an event. I think generally when somebody is trying to correct you, being gracious, thanking them for catching it and calling it to your attention so that you can hopefully reduce the barrier for folks moving forward, and then acting swiftly to make sure that things are corrected is the best advice I can think of. I don't know, Eric, if you had any other thoughts about that.
If people are reacting to a live caption mistake, all I can think is that the show must go on. Try and maintain and recover as best you can. If there's something you can do to clarify in the moment, awesome.
Yeah, if in the moment you can either repeat yourself or maybe share some sort of text-based version of your notes. If like some sort of, I could think of like a brand name or something getting miscaptioned by auto captions or something, if it's sounds like another word. So sharing text-based alternatives, correct ones is the best advice I can think of.
All right. So Robert, I see your question. Do you want to ask it?
Yes, I just was looking at Wave, and I remember I had that at one time, and then I took it off. I went back again, and I found, I just put in the chat the message I see. I'm kind of careful about what I install, particularly on web browsers. I haven't checked Chrome. I found it on Edge, but I didn't look for if they have any warnings like this. But has it been like assessed for cybersecurity?
It's a good question. I don't know of an official assessment, and I will be following up if nobody else does either.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if Eric, you know of anything that's been assessed.
I don't, but I can suggest there are web-based contrast checkers as well. They require a little more tech savvy in that you have to have the hex codes for the colors used in your presentation to enter them in a web form. But you can enter the foreground and background color, and the checker will tell you whether you have sufficient contrast.
Okay.
Working in cybersecurity, I could check if this particular add-on is already in the list of things that have been evaluated. That won't take long.
That would be great. Man, it's all about who you know in show business.
And cybersecurity.
Yeah.
It's good to have a friend in cybersecurity.
Thanks.
Thanks, Julie.
It's true. Mandy, do we have time for more questions? Otherwise, I'm hoping there's also a way we can follow up later.
But yeah, we are at time, unfortunately. I was just about to interrupt and say that. We're just past time, but we can continue the conversation. I know there are other sessions that are starting right now, so if you need to leave, feel free to move over to the other session. There was a question from Scott about emojis. Are emojis to be avoided in presentations? That was the last question that I saw.
I would just say use sparingly, as with any other image. Be ready to describe it if the emoji is really important to the message. If it's a big frowny face to show that we don't like something. But also know that screen readers are going to announce an emoji by its library title. So if you mean to show somebody crying from laughter, just know that a screen reader might announce that as sobbing face and have nothing to do with laughter. So like with most images, it's about context, and try to avoid overusing them or using them as bullet points or anything like that. If a screen reader is going to have to announce that every time they see an emoji.
I think that is all of the questions. There's been some comments and things, but I will stop the recording and thank you all for coming.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.